Hello everybody and welcome back. My name is Kari and today I am doing my best books of the decade. As you may have noticed with all of the decade videos going around, and by the fact that the date that you write changed to a 2-0, not a 1, whatever the other number is, we've entered a new decade, the 20s. 2020s, not the 1920s. We'll see if that happens. Anyway, before I go off on a tangent that nobody needs to hear, including me, I am doing my best books of the decade today. I managed to come up with 10 of my best books, or my favorite books, and today I'm going to talk about them. I started using Goodreads sometime around 2008, 2009 because one of my English teachers introduced it to my friends and I. I didn't really use it, at least not to the extent that I do now. I just used it to keep track of books that I owned and more of a, oh yeah, when I'm there, because at the time I didn't have a cell phone that was, well, I didn't have a smartphone. I didn't have an iPhone until I went to college, and I think I got it my second to last year. So I just had that little Nokia thing that didn't flip and I had to, push 4 times for S. That's what I had. It didn't have Goodreads on it, and now that Goodreads is on a phone, I use it significantly more. However, I do still have some books that I kept track of or that I remembered reading in a specific time, so they are all on here. That said, let's get into it. Again, these are in no particular order except for chronological. They're just as I went through my Goodreads by date. That's how they're organized, but they're not organized as far as best to worst or anything. First one is The Crimson Petal and the White, which I read in 2012. This is a historical fiction. Michelle Faber, that's the author. Historical fiction that is about a prostitute who meets somebody and their relationship with each other. It is fascinating. It is set in Victorian times, which, as you know, is not usually my cup of tea, but I picked this one up on a whim sometime, I think right after or right before ending high school, and it was clearly made an impression on me because it just kept talking about things that, as a very sheltered girl, I had not heard of or had not been exposed to yet. And it was also written beautifully. I love the way it was written. I liked the plot. I liked the premise of it. I just liked all of it. And I also enjoyed that it wasn't necessarily the happy ending that you were expecting, or at least not that I was expecting at the age of 18. Next we have The Tiger Queens, which I read in 2015, and this, if I were ranking them, this would be in the top 3, for sure, because this one follows the women in the life of Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan, if you don't know, was a Mongol leader who conquered a very large swath of Asia, and then when he died it went to his sons? Grandsons? Not clear on that point. It went to 4 different people in his family, and the empire kind of split up from there. But following the women in his life was fascinating. It is a fictional book, but it is so good. I think it follows his mother, his wife, and his daughter, or something similar to that. Either way, these 3 different women, and so you see the same, a little bit of overlap, and then you see each different level, for lack of a better word, of his life and theirs through their eyes. And so you see the conquest of a large swath of Asia, you see, I believe, his death, and just all of this, you see this great breadth of Mongolian history through the eyes of women who, despite being amazing and equal to him, were sort of overlooked, particularly in Western history, because Western history has, all of history has many issues, but women have been erased, and I have a problem with that. I have a problem with erasing any sort of history, but I'm not going to get back on my high horse because I have been on that way too much in my last couple of videos. If you're unsure what I'm talking about, check out my December wrap-up because I kind of go off. Anyway, Tiger Queen's definitely one of my favorites because it was beautifully written, the premise was amazing, the characters were fantastic, and they're just, I don't remember any flaws in that book. The third one is To Dance with Kings by Rosalind Laker, which I read in 2016. This would also be one of my top 3 because I read this when my friend Katie was in Nicaragua, and it is about a woman and the man she loves and who loves her during the time of Louis the 14th? 14th, because he's the Sun King. Yes. And it looks at religion, because if I remember correctly, she's a Huguenot, and there's this whole Edict of Nantes thing where it says, oh yeah, we're not gonna, you know, prosecute you for your religion, and then that gets revoked in the 1600s, and a lot of massacres, a lot of blood. But it looks at religion, and it looks at sex, and it looks at power and politics and intrigue and all of that, and follows this woman and the man she loves through their very separate, distinct lives and the choices they make that really affect them and how they survive. I remember texting Katie because I was just so angry at one of the decisions the guy made. And it is the first book, and one of very few, that I have really ranted about one of the characters, because it just hit me so hard. It was so good. The fourth one is The Covenant by James Michener, which I read in 2017. This one is also fantastic. This is a book that covers the history of South Africa from 2000-ish years ago up until the 1980s, which was really fascinating. It follows one family and their generations through all of it. So it goes through the indigenous peoples there, like the Xhosa and the Zulu and the San and the Khoi, and their lives before the white people show up, and then it talks about how when the Dutch people show up, which is part of the character list, how that changed and how it affected both the Dutch and the indigenous populations, and then when the British showed up and everything just went to hell at first, it talks about how that happened and how it affected these families, and it talks about the Boers and the Boer War, and then it talks about World War II and just all of that stuff, and it even gets into apartheid, which was also fascinating because apartheid didn't end until 1994, which is shocking. It seems so recent. It was recent. It was 25, 26 years ago, that's terrifying. Whew. I just really liked how this book encompassed the entirety of South African history. James Michener's writing is amazing. His plots are really good. The one unbelievable thing about it is that it's one family that all of this is happening to. However, if you want more detailed thoughts, I will link my review to this down below. Number 5 is the Nevernight trilogy, which I also talk about in my best books of 2019, sorry. I read Nevernight and God's Grave in 2018, and then I reread the entire series, including Dark Dawn when it came out, in 2019. Like I said, this book is the ultimate revenge story. It is amazing, and I will link Pierre Ford's adaptation down below, which you should totally go see, and no, I am not going to shut up about it because it's amazing. Then we have the Athena Club, similar thing. The Athena Club is a historical science fiction that follows the daughters of Moreau, Frankenstein, Dracula, Jekyll and Hyde, etc. It also includes Sherlock and Watson, and has these women solving mysteries in the late 1800s with a snarky, feminist, yet still societally acceptable bent. And it's fantastic, and there's a lot of different characters that are written beautifully. Next we have The Silk Roads by Peter Frankopan. This is a nonfiction about the Silk Roads from about 080 to now-ish, probably about 2000 really, and how they changed the world and how the world changed them when they were really heavily traveled. I thought he did a fantastic job of looking at all of that time, because that is a lot of time to look at, and specifically how it broke down what changed in each of those time periods, why it changed, all of the context, all of the history, and what that meant for the future. I mean, the future at the time, like if it was 800 AD that he's talking about, the future means 1000 AD. That kind of stuff. It was really truly fascinating, and I went through it very quickly because it was extraordinarily well written. Then we have Daughter of Molokai, which I also read in 2019, and I also talked about in my best books of 2019 video. I've read a lot of good books in the last couple of years. This is a book that follows our main character Rachel, who is sent to an orphanage in Hawaii and then ends up being adopted by a Japanese couple who moves to mainland California. And so you follow her through the Great Depression and World War II and the Japanese internment up until the 1980s. So you see her grow up through all of this and figure out what it means to be adopted, who she is, why her parents gave her up, what it means, I think she's half Japanese herself, what it means to be Japanese in America in the 1940s and 50s, and everything like that. And I think Alan Brenner does a very good job of bringing that all into a very human perspective. The penultimate one we have is Shogun by James Clavell, which I recently, well, not necessarily recently, I read it about this time last year on audiobook. And it's a 54-hour audiobook, so not something to get into if you don't have time. This is set in 1600s Japan and follows an Englishman and his crew who get stranded there after sailing and trying to take stuff from the Portuguese. I think James Clavell's strongest point is that he can accurately compare and digest and write about Western culture versus Japanese culture, because they're two extraordinarily different things, and if you are an outsider to either, there are things that appear to be nonsensical to you because it's not what you do in your culture. But he does a great job of showing what doesn't make sense, and then the changing attitude of the Englishman as he stays there longer and longer. The politics are fantastic. I love the characters. As I was reading it though, I distinctly remember thinking, why on earth did my father let me read this when I was 14? Because there were things in there that I did not remember and that I probably shouldn't have been reading as a 14-year-old, but here we are, and it is definitely one of my favorite books. The last one is kind of a cheat, but it is House of Four Winds and the Fairy Godmother by Mercedes Lackey. It's a cheat because these are technically two books, but they are both fairy tale retellings, which is why I'm counting them sort of as one. I read The House of 12 Winds in 2019 and The Fairy Godmother in 2018, but I adore Mercedes Lackey. If you've been here a couple months, you know that, because I think her writing is amazing. Her plots are fantastic. She takes all of the tropes in fairy tales or anything else and turns them on their head, and just is one of my favorite all-time writers. Therefore, she had to make this list in some way or another. So those are the 10 best books I read in the decade. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!